So we're there to restore, if you will, the connection between people's efforts and actions and positive consequences. You can't possibly do that kind of work unless you do it with other people.
Another quote from him. I told you about writing books yesterday. Here's what Mr. Clinton said about his book while he was president. He said, "Many presidential memoirs are dull and self-serving. I want mine to be interesting and self-serving." That's good. You want a president with humor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, first, I apologize, but I couldn't really hear backstage, so I didn't know that I had been called up. Sit down. I want to thank Raymond and the organizers of the conference for inviting me, and I hope that I can say a few things that are relevant to your lives and concerns today. This is an important issue to me, and what happens in the UK is important to me and to the world. You know, I spend most of my time now, notwithstanding the recent election campaign in America, with my foundation. I work with all different kinds of people. Half the time in America and around the world, I don't even know what political party they belong to. We just agree that we're going to tackle an opportunity or try to seize a responsibility and solve a problem. And I say our goal is to figure out how to do whatever it is we're doing faster, cheaper, and better than it was done before. In other words, I think like most of you have to think every day. And the one thing that concerns me about the way we do our business in the world is that there's a disconnect between the way politics works in many places and the way the rest of the world works. What is working all over the world is creative networks of cooperation, because there is an infinite amount of information out there and too few people who understand how to put it together. And nobody knows everything, and a broken clock is right twice a day. All of us spend our lives between those two extremes, wishing we knew everything and hoping to God we're right more than twice a day. So what works to solve problems in the private sector, to create opportunity, to support entrepreneurs, coming up with a new idea that has merit and can generate something people want or solve a problem, and then figuring out how to do it. For most of the years I spent in politics, we largely debated two questions. What are you going to do? And how much money are you going to devote to it? There was almost no focus on the third question, which I believe is the 21st century's most important question, which is whatever you propose to do, and however much money you have or do not have, how do you propose to do it? How do you propose to turn your good intentions into a positive change? For me, that normally involves trying to change people's lives. And I'll give you just one example. We're working our way out of this global financial crisis now. And I suppose I should apologize to everyone here since it started in the United States. But it is an illustration of the degree to which we are interdependent, the degree to which our borders now look far more like nets than walls. And a lot of this interdependence is great. I mean, look around this crowd. Can you imagine this crowd appearing at an event like this 30 years ago? 30 years ago, this crowd would have been older, whiter, and more male. It's a lot more interesting for me to look at you. I mean, 30 years ago, I would have gazed out on a crowd full of people who looked like me, old gray-haired white guys in suits. I will say now that I have become one, I'm glad to look out at the crowd and see that my demographic has not been entirely eliminated. Thank you very much for allowing us to be a part of your gathering. There are a lot of great things about the modern world. 8-year-old kid can get on the internet and find out something in 30 seconds I had to go to university to learn. That's the good news. The bad news is, depending on what the site is, you have no earthly idea whether it's true or not, but you can get a lot of information. But the modern world is bedeviled by three huge interconnected challenges. First, it is entirely too unequal. There aren't enough jobs, they don't pay enough, all over the world. In the UK and the US, you have persistent pockets of people who are smart and willing to work, who can't find a way into this world that the rest of us are taking advantage of. India has the world's largest middle class and the world's largest number of really poor people. Both India and China have a hard time connecting the centers of their prosperity with the people who live in small towns and rural areas, and so do we in America. So do all places of vast geographic expanse. It's quite interesting that size used to be a high predictor of the ability to produce broad-based prosperity. Now, look around Europe, or look at Africa, look at any place. People who live in countries that are compact, where people live close together and have easy access to each other and common resources, tend to have more luck in generating economic opportunity and then making sure that the circle of opportunity encompasses pretty close to everybody. So the world is unequal in terms of economic opportunity and by extension in terms of access to education, healthcare, capital, and a whole array of other things. And this inequality, besides being a personal and social tragedy, is a severe constraint on a nation's growth. Every time a first-generation immigrant doesn't finish school, it hurts that person. It hurts the country where she or he lives. And we have to do something about it. We have to find a way to make our economic models more employment intensive. The second problem the world has is that it is too unstable. Instability is essential in a market economy. If you're going to reward success, there has to be the possibility of failure. And then people have to be able to pick themselves up off the ground and begin again. I lost 2 elections. A lot of my friends in business have failed and succeeded. But if there is too much instability, you might as well have a static society, because people become so scared things shut down. That's what always happens after a financial crisis, and has for centuries. And what we're still trying to claw our way out of. In the United States today, we have fixed yesterday's problems, which societies are very good at. We're very good at fixing yesterday's problems. Not so good at predicting tomorrow's and converting them. So we have the best capitalized banks we've had in 20 years. But they're not making a lot of loans, especially to smaller enterprises who need something on the order of $200,000, $100,000 or less. We have set up these rules to try to prevent the last crisis. We don't know if they're too burdensome on the community banks that are trying to generate small business growth. We're still trying to work through all that. So that's an example of instability. The fear of cyber terrorism, the vulnerability we all have to acts of violence perpetrated for various political means. All of these things add instability to a society in ways that are destructive, not constructive. So the trick of the 21st century will be how to maintain enough instability to reward enterprise and good ideas and hard work and the ability to lead and the ability to entertain us in sport and music and all of that, but not to have so much instability that things shut down. And then we have to have these years dragging along as if we have chains on our feet, which is what is frustrating people in Europe and the US and elsewhere. If you have too much, it's a severe constraint on growth and opportunity. And finally, the world is not sustainable because of the way we produce and consume energy and other more localized resources. We just had our second major hurricane hit the northeast United States, which used to be all but unheard of. No one can say global warming caused these hurricanes, but it is clear that the oceans are warmer and that warmer ocean waters lead to more severe storms, and that they're warmer for us further north. It is clear that 90% of the ice pack on the top of Greenland, which contains 8% of the world's fresh water, suffered melt this summer, and the 100-year average is 50%. If all that water melts, it could be big trouble for you. Because if 8% of the world's fresh water falls into the North Atlantic, it could block the Gulf Stream, which is what keeps Northern Europe tolerable in the winter. And some of the world's most productive economies could revert to the temperatures of the little ice age 700 years ago, with calamitous consequences for 3 or 4 months a year. That's how it could affect you. Meanwhile, the most vulnerable countries to climate change are among the poorest. And if we just listen to the insurance and reinsurance companies who have an immediate stake, we are now in the second decade in a row where payouts by insurance companies for natural disasters have tripled the previous decade. Climate change is posing the risk that people in some areas near oceans where people love to live are going to become virtually uninsurable. And we have this crazy situation in America where one of our political parties still denies the reality of climate change, but members of those parties who happen to be mayors of cities along the coastline are working with their insurers to build back, to build up, to dig deep, so that they can get insurance. So they believe in what their ideology compels them to disavow. That's our problem, not yours. but it will be your problem if America doesn't do something serious. We have cut our aggregate emissions dramatically in the last 2 years, only partly because of the economic slowdown, largely because we're shutting our coal-fired electric plants and substituting natural gas, and because we're finally getting into the solar and wind business in a big way. But if you just look at the vista of opportunities you have, and then you think about everything that could go wrong, almost everything could be clumped into one of these three categories. The world is too unequal, it is too unstable, and it is unsustainable. And so I basically try to spend my life trying to figure out how to build up the positive and reduce the negative forces of our global interdependence in a way that create more space for people to live their dreams, pursue their hopes, and be empowered to do so. I think a big part of that is trying to integrate dealing with these things into business models, and for the non-governmental organizations, the NGO movement, to try to lead coalitions of the private sector and government into being more entrepreneurial. When I was president, we got an enormous number of our new jobs from small business. But the small businesses were being spurred by the fact that information technology in the 1990s spread into every aspect of the economy. So that when I look back on those 8 years, IT employment was only 8% of the total, but it was more than 20% of the growth and more than 25% of the wage growth of the country. And it's the only time since the 1980s in our country when the bottom 20% earnings in percentage terms increased as much as the top 20%. We have to find ways to try to create this kind of entrepreneurial culture where we all focus more on what works. And meanwhile, to try to support the creation of more entrepreneurs. I'll give you just a few examples. In Haiti, where I spend a lot of my life now, before the earthquake, let me back up and say one thing. You will find, I find, that the problems of dealing with these challenges and seizing the opportunities manifest themselves very differently in poor countries, in rising economies, and in developed countries. And you may be able to identify with some of this in the work you do. But in really poor countries, what they often need are basic systems that many of you are in the process of leaving behind. If you have enough money to have solar panels on your roof or a windmill on your farm, you may not need the grid. But if you live in Haiti, 85% of the people have no electricity at all in their homes. They need systems. Systems that you never even think about. Just think about all the stuff we're taking for granted here. You'd be surprised if the screen went off, or if the microphone failed, or the lights went dark, or the air conditioning didn't work. If you get really bored with my speech, you can excuse yourself. You can go to the loo or get a glass of water. I spend a lot of my time in places where people can't take any of that for granted. In a stunning metaphor of the challenges faced by poor countries, the microphone failed when the president of Haiti was giving his inaugural address. Turned out it was a person who opposed him who actually cut the cord, so we fixed it. So I spent a lot of my time just trying to help build these systems. In China, Russia, India, Brazil, Mexico, The centers of prosperity have these systems, but they're trying to figure out how to spread them. So they have to both figure out how to keep on this modernization path they're on and how to connect to people who aren't part of it at all. Rich countries have systems, but they tend to become rigidified, more interested in holding on to present gain than creating future opportunity, more interested in holding on to position than advancing the purpose for which the institutions were set up in the first place. This is basic human nature. It's as old as the Sumerians' civilization 8,000 years ago. It's always what tests advanced societies. And it's really hard when these systems have to multitask, which is basically what Europe and America are facing now. If you have a lot of big structural debt that can't be handled over the long run, you have to retrench. If you retrench too soon in an economic downturn, you make the situation worse. That's the dilemma that the UK faces, that the Eurozone faces, that America faces. So what I've been trying to argue for the last few years in America is we should have a 10-year plan to reduce our debt that should trigger ever more steeply as economic growth returns. Then you're blocking the rise of high interest rates. If you do it too soon, what happens? You just stay flat because you cannot possibly, no matter how much you cut spending or raise taxes, revenues will still drop and your deficits will go up, because once interest rates are below the rate of inflation, that tells you that there's not enough private activity and the public sector has to do something to keep trying to spark economic growth. When private activity takes off, there'll be more demand for capital, interest rates will rise, you can worry about the deficit. So the markets say, no, 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 you have these unsustainable debts. We want to see that you're serious. Well, you can show them that you're serious, but if you act like you are before the time comes, all you do is make the debt worse. So this is a sort of challenging governmental decision that all of society has to be involved in. On the other hand, it's a great time to start a business if you can figure out what it's going to look like 5 years from now. When things are bad, it's a good time to move. If you're gifted with the ability to have a good sense of what will be needed when things aren't so bad anymore. So in that maelstrom, we need more innovators. We need more people who can imagine a future that is different from the past. Not people that are just focused on fixing something that happened yesterday so it doesn't happen again. And I personally believe one of the great challenges, not only for government, but for big private economic organizations and for NGOs, is to figure out how to become constant innovators, how to become relentlessly future-focused, how to look at a situation that seems irreconcilable and just try something. The great thing I like about being in the position I'm in now with an NGO is, unlike a business, I don't have to answer to my investors, but I'm not a public company. They don't expect me to run a profit. All I have to do is balance the books. Unlike a politician, which I was happily for nearly 30 years, if I screw up, I can say I did. We should start rewarding politicians for saying, I tried this, it didn't work, I failed, I stopped, now let's do something else. I wish there was I wish one of these organizations that gives people awards would set up an award system for innovative political leaders who try things that don't work, admit it to their voters, say we tried this, here's why we tried it, it didn't work, we stopped, we're not wasting your money anymore, and here's what we learned, so we're going to try that. Think how real it would be. It would be so much better that, you know, in politics, people are so afraid of bad press articles, they spend way too much time and energy trying to cover their backside. And it's not conducive to the kind of entrepreneurial, creative decision-making process that we all desperately need in every part of our society. So I like it when people ask me, you know, what do you think the biggest mistakes you make were as president? If you had a do-over, what would you change? I like that. Because it's inconceivable that a person could make thousands and thousands and thousands of decisions with imperfect information in a limited time frame and never err. And the idea that we have to create this sort of mythical image of people, instead of realizing, I hired a person to do a job. They made a lot of decisions. The end result was good. Not all the decisions worked out so well. Here were the ones that didn't work out so well and what we can learn from it. We need to create this kind of climate in the political systems of every country on earth. We all say we want innovators, we want people with an entrepreneurial spirit. You have to have the right to fail and admit it so you can succeed. Because if everyone knew what to do about every inequality, instability, and unsustainability challenge in the world, I'd be here talking about something else because all those problems would be solved. But let me just give you a few examples. When I left the White House in 2001, we had just arranged to set up the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria, but it had not yet been funded. The American program, which provides a lot of the world's funding that President Bush started, PEPFAR, had not yet been funded. So Nelson Mandela and I were going around the world rattling a tin cup trying to raise money to fight AIDS because only 200,000 people in the developing world were getting AIDS medicine. And even then, 6 million needed it to stay alive. And I had this incredible encounter in Barcelona with the Prime Minister of a small Caribbean country, St. Kitts and Nevis, who is a medical doctor. And keep in mind, this is 11 years ago. So he says to me, look, Bill, we don't have a denial problem on AIDS. We don't have a discrimination problem. We have a money and an organization problem. I said, well, what do you want me to do about it? He said, I want you to fix it. Now, at the time, I had about 8 employees, and I was busy building a library, which is something former presidents normally do, build a library, museum, and public policy center. And I was trying to build America's first graduate school in public service as opposed to public policy, which we did. It's the only place where you spend half your time in the field solving problems and only half your time in the classroom. But anyway, he said, I want you to fix it. And I said, okay. I had no clue what I was agreeing to. But here's what we found. In the Bahamas, the wealthiest country in the Caribbean, they actually had enough money to begin treating people on AIDS. They were buying generic medicine produced in India for sale at $500 a person a year. The market was so disorganized, they were paying $3,500 for this $500 medicine. Because no one knew what the prices was. There was no supply chain. They were going through 2 different agents who were taking massive markups. I had good relationship with India, with these countries, so we called and got them to send the money direct to the Bahamas, and their price dropped from 35 to 5, and we could treat more than 6 times as many people for the same amount of money. And I thought, boy, this is going to be thought this is going to be easy. It's my first week on the job. It got a little harder, but here's what we discovered. That since only 200,000 people in the developing world, including 130,000 in Brazil, which has its own pharmacy manufacturing operation, we're getting this, even at $500, much less than the $10,000 a year the big pharmaceutical companies were charging in the wealthy countries. Generic AIDS medicine was a low volume, high profit margin, uncertain payment business. There was no guaranteed funding stream. You were selling into the poorest places in the world. So I went to the Prime Minister of Ireland, which has a very active aid program, and the Prime Minister of Canada, and I said, would you give me $20 million a year for 5 years? Promise $100 million. I don't want you to give me the money. I want you to pick the countries with high AIDS problems you would like to help, and promise me you will release the money only when I say okay. So they did. Then I made an agreement with the countries that they would follow a strict disclosure, 100% no corruption policy in the distribution of the medicine. Then we went back to the Indians, and I said, you realize you've got this huge global public health epidemic, and you're running this business as if you had a jewelry store in a very small town. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, think about it. Like in my hometown in Arkansas where I grew up, the local jeweler was a friend of mine. He had a low volume, high profit margin, uncertain payment business. Why? Because if you run a jewelry store, you have to keep a lot of inventory, right? It costs a lot of money. People want to look at the watches, or the bracelets, or the necklace. And so that means your profit margin's got to be pretty high for every item you sell, because the volume you keep compared to the items you sell is not optimal. And then it's an uncertain payment business because someone might bring the engagement ring back. Right? Doesn't always work out. So the guy started to laugh, but I could see he was thinking about it. You know, they were thinking about it. I said, we should run this like a vast food store chain. Huge volume, low profit margin, absolutely certain and prompt payment. He said, how are you going to do this? And I told him what we'd done, and that we were going to fix the supply chain. Anyway, I'll make a long story short. We went from, the medicine was $500 for adults, $600 for children, which was cheaper to produce in terms of materials, children's medicine, but the volumes were very low. Over the next few years, it dropped from 500 to 190 to 160 to 120 to 90, and the children's drugs dropped from 600 to 60. And every time, and the deal we made with our Indian and subsequent South African partners, was that if they didn't make more money doing it this way, we would rewrite the contracts. I gave them my word. I didn't want them to lose money. But first there were just these two countries. Then pretty soon, Ireland and Canada. Pretty soon others started helping. Then the Global Fund came on, then the PEPFAR funds came on, and the price just kept dropping like a rock because the business model changed. Think of how many people would be dead today and how much money would have been wasted if we hadn't first had to change the economic model. There are lots of things like that in the world. And ironically, we were probably fortunate that we got to change the economic model before the money poured in, because the money then poured into a much more efficient system. And now we've applied the same thing thanks to, partly to DFID. You should be very proud of this. Whatever your political party is, I think it's great, even though you already know, I think both the United States and the UK and Europe jumped the gun on this austerity. I think they needed to have an austerity plan that didn't implement itself, that wasn't implemented so soon. I'm really proud of the UK for not cutting back on foreign assistance to poor countries. It's a great thing for the world. And we should be. So the Unedited started to help us, and a lot of other countries did, and the Gates Foundation did. And we applied this model to testing equipment and laboratory equipment, and then to malaria drugs. And eventually we got the big pharmaceutical industry in it because Pfizer, America's biggest company, produces the only drug in the world you can take if you have tuberculosis and AIDS to treat the tuberculosis. It doesn't make you so sick you can't function. It saves lives and you can function normally. They gave us a 60% discount. And I said, why are you doing this? And this is attitudinal. This is how they said, well, all the big pharmaceutical companies, we're trying so hard to preserve our patent that basically what we want is 100% of the business of 15% of the world. He said it's a stupid business model. Better to take a lower profit margin and sell to the other 85%. So every one of you faces decisions like this. Whatever it is you're doing. And you have to say, is there a different way to look at this? Is there a different way to, can you imagine a different outcome where you don't ask anybody else to take a hit? You just figure out a different way for people to win so that there are more winners. Biggest public health problem in America is childhood obesity. You have an initiative in the UK, there's one in Ireland. It's a huge problem now in India as they abandon the world's best diet, I think, for Western fat foods that will kill you quicker as they move to cities. And when I had my heart surgery and some of the advocates asked me to take this issue on, I thought, you know, I'm going to fail at this. Changing a culture is like turning the Titanic around before it hits the iceberg. There's billions and billions of decisions are made every day about how food is produced, transported, packaged, sold, and consumed. But I learned one thing, that 50 to 60% of the total calories a lot of kids, mostly lower income kids, the total calories they were consuming every day, they were getting out of just high sugar drinks they got in school. Just the drinks. So all the advocates were saying we need to have a tax on these drinks. I'm not in Congress, I don't get a vote on that. I'm not president anymore, I can't propose a bill. Besides, there'd be a riot in America if we tried to tax people's soft drinks. Much fun. So anyway, I thought about the AIDS thing. We got all the soft drink people together. And we said, look at what's happening to the rate of diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, the kind you get from living, not the kind you're born with, was commonly called in the U.S. for decades adult onset diabetes. And 3 years ago, the American Medical Association said, you have to stop that. We have too many children with type 2 diabetes before their teen years, all because of what they're eating and how they are or are not exercising. So we got all the big soft drink people together. Coke, Pepsi, Cadbury, Schweppes, and a lot of the people with the high sugar juice drinks. And I said, look, you got a choice to make here. You can keep pumping these kids for money. And then by the time they're in their 30s or 40s, they'll be diabetic. Some of them have amputated limbs. They'll cost you a fortune in managed health care, plus the human tragedy. Or they can keep drinking your products till they're 95 and die a happy death in old age. And I don't believe that you were intentionally trying to make this the first generation of Americans to live shorter lives than their parents. But you're all meeting the competition. If, however, you all agreed to get those full sugar soft drinks out of the schools, out of the vending machines, out of the cafeterias. If you all agreed to get the full-size juice drinks, which are heavy in sugar, out of the schools, if you went to more flavored waters, if you went to other things, and you did it together, you would all be making money. You'd just be making it in a different way. And if you have a long time horizon, you'd have these customers around for much longer in a future where your operating costs from healthcare would be lower. And all my friends in the advocacy community said that I had finally lost my mind, that I was living in another planet. I was so naive. Last month, we got a 4-year report. There has been, totally voluntarily in the United States, a 90% reduction in the total calories shipped to our schools from drinks. It was a business deal. It was humanitarian, it was generous, it was kind, it was compassionate, but it worked for them. And so that's the larger point I want to make to you today. We got to find ways to make climate change work as an economic opportunity. I just don't buy this idea. Even the UN panel said for us to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050, we only have to cut global GDP by 1%. And if we don't do it, natural disasters are going to cut it 4 or 5 times more. I don't buy that. I think changing the way we produce and consume energy and sources and doing more with less is the single biggest economic opportunity of the next 20 years for the global economy, after which we'll have explosive opportunities in biotechnology and God only knows what else. So, on a much more limited basis, we just set out to try to prove that, and we look for partners. Haiti has a horrible protein shortage. It has only 10% as much fish consumption as Jamaica, for example. So there's a guy in Haiti who was born in the Ivory Coast, who moved to Haiti to feed hungry people, who has a fish farming operation that runs entirely on solar power. He raises these fish until they are about that size, tilapia. Then he gives them to farmers and shows them how to grow them in lakes, natural lakes, and he splits the profit with them. I met a farmer, a Haitian farmer with 8 children, whose income went from $500 a year to $2,200 a year, being part of this system, and we are raising the health of the people. A woman, about 70% of these fish grow to full size and are sold in restaurants and markets. The other 30% are sold on the street in Haiti by women who can earn more money in 3 hours in the morning selling fish in the market than they can working in a factory for 8 hours a day. All because of the use of solar power in a smart, intelligent way. If you go to Sao Paulo, one of the biggest cities in the world, at the site of the 2 major landfills, they're trying to close the landfills by recycling all the plastic, metal, and glass, by taking all the organic matter and turning it into fertilizers for farmers, and everything else goes into power plants. So instead of emitting very harmful methane gases, they're creating clean electricity. We should close every landfill in every big city in the entire world. It's an economic winner if you do it right. The fundamental problem in all this clean energy stuff is getting the financing right, because all the costs are up front and the benefits are over a lifetime. But if you do it, it's a great thing. There are 2 big developments in the London area that are part of this zero emissions contest that my foundation worked with the C40s group, there are far more than 40 cities in it now, a group of cities committed to drastic reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. These whole developments will be zero emission developments. I was just in the Danish city of Sønderborg, which is just across the German border in southern Denmark. They aim to be a zero emissions county, 80,000 people, zero emissions by 2029. And they have great little buttons, because you have to look at it twice, because it seems strange to pass someone wearing a button that says, "I'm a zero." What looks like a put down is actually bragging. But they reduced their emissions 18% in 3 years. They're going to do 25% more by 2020, and they'll be down to zero emissions. The island of Borgland, which is part of Denmark, has 44,000 people. It's already carbon positive when it comes to electricity. That is, they produce more from the sun and the wind, and they have very rigorous building standards, so they have super efficient, that they're sending power back to the main island where Copenhagen is. They aim to be a zero emissions island quicker than Sønderborg. So the 44,000 people had a massive community meeting and decided that they would all drive electric cars on the island. They would buy these electric mini cars and drive them around on their island, and they wouldn't drive their regular cars except when they went on long trips. So a friend of mine, an American, opened a plant in the United States, and his first 2 years of production are already accounted for by one island in Denmark. These little two-seater cars. And they're going to do it. Hundreds of jobs have been created by this one little island. There is nothing that would create more opportunity for entrepreneurs, for the revival of manufacturing, than changing the way we produce and consume energy. By far, the most labor-intensive thing you could do is to retrofit all the buildings. London started this whole movement among big cities, and I believe now, and Ken Livingston started it, Mayor Johnson has continued it. I believe that London has in train plans for 231 major building retrofits. You got a lot more buildings than that. You need to make it more attractive. Essentially, I haven't worked out the pounds ratio, but essentially, in the U.S., for every $1 billion you invest in retrofitting buildings, the average payout of which is somewhere between, depending on how much you save energy, 3 and 6 years. For every $1 billion you create 7,000 new jobs. That's a very job-intensive thing to do. And you can train people to do this work who don't have a lot of formal education. So if you look at it like an entrepreneur who happens to be an environmentalist, who happens not to want the UK flooded by the rise of the oceans, you come up with a whole different set of possibilities than if you look at it as if the only thing we have to do is pass a bunch of regulations and force people to do the right thing. You're creating a chance for people to flourish in a whole new entrepreneurial cluster. If you can do it with public health, if you can do it with climate change, you can do the same thing with the education challenges we face, the same thing I could go through lots of other things. And so I ask you to think about that. I think the 21st century world will rise or fall essentially on how people make 3 decisions. How are they going to relate to each other? So I love the work that Tony Blair's Faith Foundation does around the world. How do you respect who you are? Your race, your culture, your faith, or lack thereof. The world is becoming less racist, less sexist, and less homophobic in most places, but not everywhere. And even in places where people fancy themselves as totally broad-minded and accepting of others, most people still have one bad blind spot. They do not wish to be around anybody they disagree with. Don't you find that? It's a huge problem in America. We have been sorting ourselves out for 30 years now based on who we agree with. In 1976, we had a close presidential election in America. And our counties where the lines never changed, the same boundaries. Only 20% of America's counties voted for either Jimmy Carter or Gerald Ford by 20% or more. Every place else was closer. So if you walked into a salon or a cafe, people were sitting around with their friends and neighbors, honestly arguing the competing merits of their candidates and positions. There were relationships. By 2004, when Senator John Kerry gave President Bush the closest re-election of any president re-elected since Woodrow Wilson in 1916, it was a much closer election, people know, because the war in Iraq was ongoing, and in the history of America, no president's ever been defeated while a war was going on. But 48% of the counties voted for one or the other of them by more than 20%. President Obama just won a titanic victory in the state of Ohio, which is pretty... And I worked hard for it. No, here's the point for you and your neighbors. Think of this. But in the race for the House of Representatives, my party did worst in the so-called swing states. Why? Because we won those states by getting the people who already disagreed with us to the polls. And the Republicans tried to win it by doing the same thing, which meant that the districts where my party had somebody representing which had at least as many of the other guys as us, they all got beat. They were sort of corollary casualties of a world in which we don't support reaching across the divides. So how we manage our differences, number one. Number two, how we manage technology. You like all these drones that fly around in the air? How are you going to feel when they're the size of bumblebees? How can technology continue to be humanity's friend? And finally, how we manage our relationship to the earth, which is screaming at us to remember basic things like photosynthesis. If you want to put more carbon in the air, you need something breathing it back in so we can sustain the balance of the earth. I am convinced that all over the world, people in the public and the private sectors and the NGOs are going to have to think more like entrepreneurs, less bureaucratically, less rigidly, less sanctimoniously, and less like we got all the answers. And whether we like it or not, we are going to have to spend time talking to people, and more important, listening to people who don't look like us, don't think like us, don't live like us, and may think we're taking the world to hell in a handbasket. And unless we figure out how to do that, we are going to have a very difficult time in an interdependent world where all our borders look more like nets than walls. But if we do that, then all of you who are younger than me, which is virtually 100% of this audience, will live in the most interesting time in human history. And this financial crisis will just be a bad dream that led a long hangover. It'll go away. The fundamental forces, the big trend lines, involve the battles of empowerment, inclusion, and entrepreneurialism on one side, against the forces of inequality, instability, and unsustainability on the other. I'd give anything. I would give up having been president to be 25 years old and have a chance to chart a course through the next 30 years. It should be the most interesting time in human history. I wish you well, and I hope you make the most of it. Thank you.